Time for another swig from the Tinny of truth, mates. And if you aren't totally wasted by now, you might remember that last time we were getting our shit together to go lay the beat down on the big man in the Vatican. But you know what? The Pope Master was fucking packing heat. They had a fuck ton of men, guns and horses, and some of them even looked like they knew what they were doing, unlike my men who'd only just worked out that their muskets weren't meant to be thrown like javelins. So now, as king, I had to make a decision. Send my men in to die and increase the average IQ of my nation 20 points, or double up on the crazies to make sure we got those popely professors without too much hassle. I went for the second option, especially considering the fact that if I got my men into a fight and it all went wrong, we'd probably be like 50 points up on the IQ count, so I thought whether I got the university or not, our nation was going to get smarter. While the next mob was being tempted into service by the promise of a shiny hat that they got to keep afterwards, I was scoping out places to stage my little D-Day. I thought that if I landed right at the Pope's door, it would be easy for him to just send out his warrior monks or whatever he had, so it was probably going to be easier to land elsewhere and then get the God Squad out into the open. To do that, I had to ride over to Austria and have a word with their dickbag emperor. He didn't know how to take a bribe with dignity, making me pile up more and more cash on the table before finally he agreed to help us put the Pope in the ground, as long as we sent him a souvenir holy chamber pot or some shit. With that, we were ready to invade by land, just had to wait for the next refuse dump from my barracks and I'd be good to go. But right then I encountered my arch nemesis, the man who thought he could steal my good name and freeload off my fucking AAA reputation as a leader. That's right, it was the other bloody Napoleon, the Frenchy one, and he, being the dick that he is, had conquered the lands I had just paid hand over fist to get into, and he'd instantly sent the bouncers to bum rush my army back into the sea. Now at first I tried to be polite, I really did. I went to this freak and asked him, with a pretty near straight face, if I could still use the lands to kill the Pope. Obviously he was totally jelly of my epic kingdom building, because he was like, nah mate, I promised my ex-wife she could park her carriage there while we worked things out, and you know how she gets if I don't keep her promises. You know, like the time I promised there was nothing between me and that wheel of cheese. Yeah, he was a fucking nutcase for bloody sure, and I wasn't getting what I wanted out of him. So I moonwalked out, flipping him the double bird, and returned to my throne room to quiz my nog on what to do next. Option 1 was to do this the underhanded way, and just get in with the Pope's next door neighbour, Naples. They were pretty close friends with the Pope, but there isn't a friendship in the world that can't be broken with a little bribe and a few crates of semi-legally obtained tea, so we got our foot right into their door. A few weeks later, we had the second pile of theoretical soldiers ready to go, so it was time for D-Day Round 2. This time I called it G-Day, so if any bogans asked what I was doing with thousands of elementary school dropouts in fancy dress, I could just say "G'day" and walk off knowing I was telling the straight truth. During that time, I'd come up with a new plan of attack. We were going to sail round to the other side of Italy, getting us close to the university we were meant to be boosting, and keeping us away from the Pope's entourage of cold-blooded Catholics straight out of the Vatican. So we rolled up nice and simple. And then right outside I sent a cheeky text to the Pope to tell him we were going to rustle his jimmies. Two big problems though. The Pope texted back seeing his bros Naples and Austria were in town and looking to lay the muscle on the guy who kept threatening to kill God's BFF. I bet Pius McPoperson or whatever his name was pretty pleased with himself, but clearly he forgot I was the fucking Bill Gates of 1806. I could buy whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I bought both those posers off with the cash between the cushions of my throne and went on my merry way. We rolled up on Rome, and obviously the Pope knew we were coming as he had a bunch of his goons clogging up the bridge we were going to cross. Luckily these guys weren't exactly chess grandmasters and had forgotten there was another bridge round the corner, so we just walked like 10 feet further on to go cross there. The Pope dopes suddenly bolted out and went to the university. Probably a good move considering their lack of intellect, but of course it meant they were now out of the warm embrace of their priests. So we picked up the barbie and marched back to the uni with all the strength of a nation dragged up from total scum fuckery by a man who had one too many and tripped into a magical swamp. Sure enough, when we showed up they were still there, drinking from the river downstream of the levees like a bunch of arse-hats. We spooked them off a little, but soon they formed up for a full-on battle. Now I know this was our first real action, but I was checking out the local wine tasting scene, so I told my freaky generals to go get started and I'd roll by later once I'd finished my pre-lash. I showed up a little later than expected and the place was covered in dead bodies. I'd been to worse get-togethers, but still I was quite disappointed we'd managed to lose half our men despite having the monk circus totally outnumbered and surrounded. Still, these guys weren't exactly the brightest of the bunch, which was the whole reason we were there, so we just had to continue on. We knew the Pope had lost half his shit that night, so now we could go trash the rest of it. Everything was going fine until the Vanguard suddenly got cold feet about the whole thing. I think the Pope threatened to treat them all to his finger of heaven party trick or something, because they just turned and sprinted like 100 miles right past our main force. I had to go over and remind them that if I wasn't having a bath in a tub made of solid gold by the end of the week, then they'd all be straight to bed with no pudding for a year. That straightened them up. We got back to business. We moved up a little more carefully after that, taking one step at a time to make sure the stress of remembering how to walk didn't demoralise the men. Finally, after shuffling awkwardly through the countryside day and night like a conga line of guys who'd shit themselves, we got to Rome. It was time for a proper battle, with the Vatican veterans on their side and sentient cardboard cutouts on ours. The battle itself wasn't too fleshy. I mean, I wasn't the most experienced general, but I was able to work out that having the cannons fire in the vague direction of the enemy was probably a good shout. The Pope pushers were doing the same back to us, so I guess it was the go-to strategy for battle virgins. I tried thinking back to my old days playing Command & Conquer on my Windows 95, but all I remembered was that you needed to build nuclear power plants every 10 yards and watch out for airstrikes. That didn't come in very useful, so I just got my men to walk forwards in a giant straight line, Battle of the Somme style. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeve. They went berserk and sent their cavalry charging right at me, already half shot up from the cannons and gagging for some bloody revenge. My generals were going on about forming up in squares, which I was a little worried about since I didn't think my men knew about quadrilaterals, but sure enough they knew what I was saying and stood in a square. I didn't have a fucking clue why I'd done that, but it turns out that horses are scared of squares or something because they ran at the sight of it. I told my generals that maybe it was the bullets rather than the squares, but they insisted it was the squares. Now I thought it was time to apply the scientific method to this matter, so I tried telling the men to worry less about getting their corners to be exactly 90 degrees, and more about trying to shoot the great lamps of sword-wielding Christ crazies coming at them. To be honest, I was shocked. It didn't do a damn thing. They slammed into my men and started killing them. I shouted for them to form the square as a last resort, and the second the enemy horses heard the word, they bolted right back again. The enemy, obviously a little too into their Simon Says, started forming squares as well. Squares have become a fucking battlefield meme all of a sudden, and the cavalry weren't having any of it. I think horses have a dark history with squares that they just don't want to come to terms with, but that's their problem. For me, it was time to flip over and be the giver rather than the taker. The enemy's main body was preparing an attack, running about chaotically and ignoring most of my men. My generals were worried it was some secret plan, but I had a way to test that too. Shoot anything that looks the least bit papal and see what happens. Only problem was my men couldn't see shit through all the smoke, and the smell of spaghetti bolognese wasn't enough to go on, I guess. So they just fired at random, and at least that got the enemy to take things seriously. They finally got in a nice line opposite to mine so we could do the whole shoot each other to death thing like pros. It was all getting a little bit hot, but I knew I had two giant advantages that would win me the day. First, my men were wearing better hats than theirs. Second, I had their flanks totally plastered with gunmen and cav, just waiting to swamp the whole field with open cans of whoop-ass and turn the Jesus Jubilee into a funeral director's wet dream. I gave the signal and the ship went so far down it came back up covered in fucking magma. Long story short, we had a sudden influx of damaged red overcoats to sell by the end of the day. It was a slaughter that went down in history, or at least it did until the master of fake French fuckery came along and rewrote it all, but let's save that rage for another time. For now, it was a grand day to be the king of Sardinia. We had given the mouth of God a lesson in the momentum of lead balls and the effect of sudden dissipation of energy on human flesh. And of course, that meant that I was sitting in a nice deep bath of holy water by the end of the day. Rome was now part of Sardinia, a fact that pissed their people off to no end, but soon they'd realise it was the best thing that ever happened to them. Of course, it meant now that the local Illuminati could be turned to working out how the hell we were going to turn Sardinia into less of a dive. Thanks to me, the future of our backwater island was as bright as the sun in an ozone-free sky. But of course, that's all just page 1 of my biography. The good shit's still in store. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeves. What the fuck? The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeves. What the fuck? Australia. I'll have a put another tinny on the barbie, mates. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeve. They had a trick up their sleeve. They had a trick up their sleeve. But they had a trick up their sleeve. But the idea caught on. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeve. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeve. They went berserk and started charging. It turns Irish. The idea caught on and the enemy did the same, but they had a trick up their sleeves. I can't do it. Australia.